Good morning. Good morning, everyone. And glad to see you all here. So during the last few sessions, we've been talking about the precepts. There are 16 traditional Zen precepts. And some of them derive from an early writing called the Brahmanet Sutra. And that seems to be the earliest written record of these precepts. And there are 10 what are considered great or prohibitory precepts, and we talked about the first two, so we've gotten up to number 3. And the third precept, as simply stated by Dogen, is not to misuse sex. Not to misuse sex is the third precept. And going back to the Brahmanet Sutra to see how it's stated there in translation. One translation of it is like this: a disciple of the Buddha must not engage in licentious acts or encourage others to do so. As a monk, he should not have sexual relations with any female, be she a human, animal, deity, or spirit, nor create the causes, conditions, methods, or karma of such misconduct. Indeed, he must not engage in improper sexual conduct with anyone. So you'll notice many of these early Buddhist writings are from a male perspective, because the great majority of monastics at that time were male. And there was a hierarchy that was patriarchal. But the Brahmanet Sutra really discourages any sort of dallying with females. And there are more modern renditions of the third precept, just to name a few, or a couple. At Zen Mountain Monastery, they state it this way: honor the body, do not misuse sexuality. The Zen Peacemakers, based in New York, but an international organization, is more creative. They say, encountering all creations with respect and dignity, this is the precept of chaste conduct. Encountering all creations with respect and dignity. And Bodhidharma is said to have stated it in this way: self-nature is subtle and mysterious. In the realm of the ungilded Dharma, not creating a veneer of attachment is called the precept of not misusing sex. So this precept is about not misusing sex, but I guess you have to back up and say, what is using sex? What is sex used for? Well, of course, from a biological perspective, It's very useful. It results in the recombination of DNA so that we're all not clones of one another. So that within a species, there is a diverse population of unique individuals. And this provides for resilience, because if we were all clones of one another, and if there were some specific genetic vulnerability and conditions arose that affected that vulnerability, then we would all be wiped out uniformly. Whereas when there is genetic diversity, some individuals will be more profoundly affected than others, and some will survive, and the species can continue. And this process always also provides the engine for evolutionary change, so that the species can respond to changes in the environment over time. So there's a very important biologic use for sex, and also sex has a social utility, and that it's one of many ways of expressing love. It also is, so it allows for bonding of relationships, so it can be used positively in that way. So what is the misuse of sex? Well, as I mentioned, the early writings in Buddhism are from a male perspective, and the monks who followed the Buddha were bound by a vow of celibacy. Which produced a set of problems, because there, of course, is the innate sexual desire that has to be dealt with. And the sexual energy, especially in the young, is very strong. So one of the ways, I'd say probably the dominant way that this was dealt with among those monks, was by cultivating aversion to the female body. And there was a, for example, in the Therigatha, which is a collection of verses written by monks and incorporated in the Pali Canon, there is a verse that shows that this aversion could very easily tip over into misogyny. The verse goes, "You little hut made of chain of bones, sewn together with flesh and sinew, fie upon the evil-smelling body. You cherish those who have another's limbs. You bag of dung tied up with skin, you demoness with lumps on your chest. These are there are the 9 streams in your body which flow all the time. Your body with its 9 streams makes an evil smell and is obstructed by dung. A bhikkhu desiring purity avoids it as one avoids excrement." And it goes on, which I won't continue, but you can see that this is a strategy that is associated with its own problems. And especially as Buddhism spread and became more commonly a practice among lay people. This sort of approach was obviously inappropriate, as was the vow of celibacy. Religious orders that are vowed to celibacy do tend to die out. There have been examples of that over time. So as Buddhism evolved and incorporated more lay practitioners, the concept of misusing sex became more complicated. Further complicated by differences in cultural mores, because what is looked upon favorably in one part of the world may be viewed very much unfavorably in other parts of the world. For instance, even now, what is viewed as holy matrimony in one part of the world is viewed as statutory rape elsewhere. And what is viewed as sexual preference or orientation in one part of the world is punishable by imprisonment, torture, or death in other parts of the world. So there are all these differences to take into account. And even in the monastic tradition, celibacy was not maintained as a rule in some places, particularly in Japan. And very early on in Japan, there were priests who married and had families. So there's a nice essay by Judith Rajir. She's a Zen priest in St. Paul, Minnesota, who founded the Cloud in Waters Zen Center. And she writes an essay about what she entitles the paradoxes of the married Zen priest. And in that, she includes a couple quotes that I think are relevant here. One is from Honen. Honen was not a Zen priest, but a Buddhist priest in the Pure Land tradition who lived a little bit earlier than Dogen. Their lifespans overlapped. And he was asked once about whether a religious person should be celibate or not. And he said, if it is easier for him or her to express faith by reciting the Buddha's name alone, he should be celibate. If it is easier for him to do that with a spouse, it is better to marry. What is important is only how one expresses one's faith in reciting the Buddha's name. In the Pure Land tradition, reciting the Buddha's name is the central practice. In Zen, Zazen is the central practice. But both of them are practices that are intended to expand out into the rest of one's life. So he's saying basically, if you can cultivate your practice better, by being celibate, do so. If you can cultivate it better by being married, do so, or having a partner, do so. So Rajir also talks about another story, this pertaining to a 15th century Zen priest named Ikkyu. And I'll just read this little section from her essay. This koan is coming from the book 3, Ikkyu, Hakuin, and Rokan by John Stevens. Ikkyu Sojun is a very renowned and beloved teacher, even though he was one of the most eccentric. He was acknowledged as a genius in his time. He was revered enough to be abbot of important Zen temples, but in his unusual nature, he hated the hypocrisy and rule-bound nature of his fellow monastics and is famous for breaking the rules, living freely and wandering through life in his own style. He shares this with many other noted Zen characters in Japan in particular. He describes his own living freely as better look for me in the fish stall, a sake shop, or a brothel. He also is described as taking long retreats in remote, tumble-down hermitages, devoting himself to old-fashioned Zen training. So one of the stories about Ikkyu goes like this. One day, Ikkyu was traveling in an isolated area when he happened upon a naked woman preparing to bathe in a river. Ikkyu stopped, bowed reverently toward her, and continued on his way. Several passerbys who witnessed this unusual scene ran after Ikkyu for an explanation of his strange behavior. And Ikkyu responded, an ordinary man would have Googled this naked woman. But why did you bow to her naked body and sexuality, they ask. And Ikkyu responded, women are the source from which every being has come, including the Buddha and Bodhidharma. So one way of thinking about what the meaning of the misuse of sex is to refer to the other precepts for guidance. So one can ask, is this speech or behavior harmful to another person and or myself? Am I employing deceit or using sexuality to manipulate another? Am I taking what is not freely given? Am I using sexuality as an intoxicant, as an escape? And am I regarding all beings as kindred spirits? Thich Nhat Hanh states in a discussion of the third precept, states it this way: aware of the suffering caused by sexual misconduct, I undertake to cultivate responsibility and learn ways to protect the safety and integrity of individuals, couples, families, and society. I am determined not to engage in sexual relations without love and long-term commitment to preserve the happiness of myself and others. I am determined to respect my commitments and the commitments of others. I will do everything in my power to protect children from sexual abuse and to prevent couples and families from being broken by sexual misconduct. So I think we can ask. Thich Nhat Hanh spreads out this third precept very broadly, and I think we can ask about whether it can go beyond our narrow notion of sexual activity, and can include avoiding situations where sexual energy is used in order to deceive or to manipulate, as is commonly the case in advertising, or whether it's used to disparage another person, as in sexual harassment. So I think there's depth in this precept, as there is in each of them. And I guess I'll leave you with the question of, what is it to misuse sex? How broadly do we interpret this precept? So thank you for listening, and we'll break up into groups for discussion.